Picture this. It's just past midnight, January 24th, 1942, 7 weeks after Pearl Harbor. You're standing on the bridge of a destroyer, one of four American tin cans threading south through the Maksar Strait off the eastern coast of Borneo. The water is black. The sky above you is black. But the horizon ahead? The horizon is on fire. The oil refineries at Balikpapan are burning. The Dutch blew them before they fled, denying the Japanese the prize they came for. Or at least trying to. The flames are massive. Columns of black smoke roll up into the night sky and spread across the stars. The whole southern horizon glows orange and red, like a false dawn that never quite arrives. And reflected in the water beneath you, the strait itself looks like it's burning too. You are sailing directly toward it. Your ship is old. She's a four-stacker, a Clemson-class destroyer built in the early 1920s, designed for a different war. Kept in service because there is nothing to replace her. Her engines are tired. Her torpedoes are unreliable. Her crew has been running hard since the war started 7 weeks ago, sleeping in snatches, eating when they can, operating out of improvised bases with spare parts that don't always arrive and fuel that's never quite enough. They are exhausted. They are still here. These There are four of these ships: USS John D. Ford, USS Pope, USS Parrott, USS Paul Jones. Together, they make up the striking force of Destroyer Squadron 59. And tonight, they are about to do something that, by any rational calculation, they probably should not survive. Ahead of them, anchored in the roadstead off Balikpapan, is a Japanese invasion convoy. Transports, dozens of them, loaded with troops, equipment, and machinery of conquest, escorted by warships, surrounded by smaller patrol craft. The Japanese are in the middle of an amphibious landing operation. They have putting men ashore all day, and the last thing they expect at this hour in these waters is four American destroyers coming straight at them out of the dark. That's about to be their problem. The man who decided to do this is Commander Paul Tabbitt. He's the squadron commander, a Naval Academy man, class of 1915, which means he graduated the same year the Navy was still figuring out what to do with airplanes. He's been in the service for nearly 30 years. He knows what these ships can and can't do. He knows what he's asking of his men, and he's doing it anyway. Because the situation in the Southwest Pacific in January of 1942 demands exactly this kind of audacity. And because, frankly, there isn't a lot left to lose by trying. There is no air cover for this mission. There is no cruiser escort, no radar suite worth relying on, no cavalry coming over the hill if things go wrong. Talbot's orders gave him discretion to attack if conditions permitted. And he looked at the burning horizon, looked at his charts, looked at his four aging destroyers, and decided that conditions permitted. What follows over the next several hours is the first surface engagement fought by American naval forces against the Japanese Empire in the Second World War. It will be chaotic. It will be audacious. It will It will involve torpedoes that don't always run straight, targets that are hard to identify in smoke and fire, and 4 destroyers wheeling through a crowded anchorage at high speed while the Japanese try to figure out what is happening to them. It will not stop the invasion of Balikpapan. The Japanese will land. The oil facilities will fall. On the grand strategic ledger of the Pacific War in early 1942, this engagement barely registers. But here's the thing about that framing: it misses what this battle actually was. This was American sailors on worn out ships with a bad hand of cards choosing to play offense in the worst stretch of the war. This was a commander deciding that to answer to impossible that the answer to impossible odds was not to wait for better odds, but to move. This was 4 destroyer crews executing a night attack on a defended anchorage and getting all 4 ships home. History has a tenacity to remember the big battles: Midway, Leyte Gulf, the Coral Sea, the engagements that shifted the tide. That make for clean narratives of turning points and decisive moments. The first battle of Balikpapan doesn't fit that category. It's a footnote in most books. A paragraph, maybe 2, a curiosity. We think it deserves better than that, and that's why we're here today. Over the next hour, or however long the show lasts, we're going to walk you through everything. The strategic collapse unfolding across the Dutch East Indies in January 1942. The Japanese invasion force bearing down on Borneo's oil coast. The 4 American destroyers and the exhausted men who crewed them. The plan Talbot put together with almost nothing to work with. The approach through the burning strait, the torpedo runs, the gun action, the withdrawal, and then the honest accounting of what it actually meant. This is a U.S. Navy History Podcast. I'm your host, Dale, joined as always by Christoph. And today
Hello.
we are going back to January 1942, to the SR Strait, to the fire on the horizon, and to the 4 tin cans that went looking for a fight.
So, a couple things. One, I guessed the right country. When you said oil and Dutch, I was like, that's got to be Indonesia or Dutch East Indies in that case. But everything else sounds unfathomable as far as what the Americans were willing to do with what equipment against what enemy. At this point, Japan is very strong, very capable, well supplied.
Yep.
This does not sound like a fight you want to pick, especially given the ships that you have and also the ships that you don't have. So, again, I've never heard this story. I'm looking forward to finding out more as we go through it.
To understand why 4 American destroyers were sailing into a burning anchorage off the coast of in January of 1942, you have to understand just how badly things were going. And they were going badly. 7 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the strategic picture in the Pacific and Southeast Asia was not simply bad. It was cascading. It was a series of dominoes falling faster than anyone had predicted, faster than anyone had planned for, faster than the Allied command structure could respond to. And at the center of that cascade was a question that every Allied planner understood in their bones: who controls the oil? Because the oil was everything. Japan in 1941 was a modern industrial military power with one crippling vulnerability. She had almost no domestic petroleum production. Her war machine ran on imported oil, and the overwhelming majority of that oil came from one source: the United States. When the Roosevelt administration imposed a full oil embargo on Japan in the summer of 1941, the clock started ticking. Japanese military planners calculated they have roughly 18 months of reserves. After that, the fleet stops moving. The aircraft stop flying. The empire stops functioning. The solution, as Tokyo saw it, was the Dutch East Indies, or modern day Indonesia, a sprawling archipelago of thousands of islands stretching across 3,000 miles of ocean, controlled since the 17th century by the Netherlands, and sitting on some of the most productive oil fields in the world: Sumatra, Java, Borneo. The petroleum infrastructure the Dutch had built there over decades was, in 1941, producing roughly 65 million barrels of oil per year. For Japan, seizing that infrastructure intact wasn't a strategic bonus. It was the entire point of going to war. This is the context in which the Balikpapan sits. The town itself is on the eastern coast of Borneo, Dutch Borneo at this point, and it is home to refineries and storage facilities that represent a significant piece of that Dutch East Indies oil picture. The Netherlands, or the Netherlands, you know what? I'm not even going to try. The Dutch Colonial Petroleum Company had been operating there for decades. The infrastructure is real, it is valuable, and the Japanese want it. But seizing oil fields is only useful if you seize them intact. Blow the refineries, destroy the wells, fire the storage tanks. And the prize you've just conquered is a smoking ruin that takes years to restore. The Japanese knew this. The Dutch knew the Japanese knew this. And so, from the very opening days of the war, the question hanging over Balikpapan and every other petroleum installation in the Dutch East Indies was simple: who gets there first, and what condition is it when they arrive? Now, the Allied command structure responsible for defending all of this was called ABDACOM, American, British, Dutch, Australian Command. It was established in January 1942, just weeks before the battle we're discussing today, under British General Sir Archibald Wavell. The idea was coalition warfare, pooling the resources of four nations to present a unified defense of the so-called Malay Barrier, the chain of islands running from the Malay Peninsula through Sumatra, Java, and Bali, designed to block Japanese southward expansion. In practice, Abdicom was a bureaucratic nightmare built on a foundation of scarcity. The Americans were still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The British were dealing with the catastrophic loss of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, two capital ships sunk by Japanese air power off Malaya on December 10th, just 3 days after the war started, and simultaneously watching Singapore, their great fortress in the east, come under increasing pressure. The Dutch were defending a colonial empire with a small, under-equipped navy and no realistic prospect of reinforcement from a home country that had been occupied by Nazi Germany since 1940. The Australians were contributing what they could while watching the threat arc towards their own continent. Nobody had enough of anything: not ships, not aircraft, not time. The naval commander for the American contingent in this theater was Rear Admiral William Glassford, a man doing his level best with a collection of cruisers and destroyers that were, charitably speaking, not the first team. The Asiatic fleet, which Glassford was working with, had been based in the Philippines and had already taken losses and disruption from the opening Japanese strikes. It was now operating out of improvised bases in the Dutch East Indies, trying to contest Japanese naval movements across an enormous operational area with inadequate forces and almost no land based air support to speak of. That point cannot be overstated. In 1942, surface ships operating without air cover were vulnerable in ways that are almost impossible to overstate to a more modern audience. The loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse had just demonstrated dramatically, lethally, what Japanese air power could do to capital ships caught in the open. Every Allied naval commander in this theater was operating with that lesson freshly burned into his thinking. You could not expose your ships to Japanese air during daylight hours if you could possibly avoid it, which means your window for surface action is the night, which means every aggressive move the Allies can make has to happen in darkness, with all the confusion and risk that entails. This is what the that is the world Paul Talbot and his four destroyers are operating in when the order comes down to intercept the Balikpapan convoy. Not a world not a world of good options. Not a world of adequate resources or coherent command or reliable intelligence. A world of bad hands dealt fast, where the best you can do is play aggressively and hope the chaos breaks your way. In January 1942, chaos was about the only resource the Allies had in surplus. And into that chaos, the Japanese Southern Force was moving with speed, confidence, and a very specific destination in mind.
That is a very bold move by the Allies. Given what they had, that sounds so unattainable, really. I do have a quick question. You mentioned at the top that there were four destroyers that were going to face this invading force, and there were no cruisers. Can you help me understand the difference between a cruiser and a destroyer?
Cruisers are larger than destroyers. Destroyers are made to go in, strike, and get out fast. They are made for speed and maneuverability. Cruisers
Okay,
are made for more for striking power. You can
I
think of
see.
them between a destroyer and a battleship in size.
Okay, more maneuverable than a battleship, but not quite as tough, or not quite as has the striking power, but well above a destroyer.
Hmm.
Okay, cool. Thanks. This is the fact that they're also coming from an improvised base and not their main base that was in the Philippines. That's significant, I think, because it's not made to supply these ships. It's not made to support this kind of frequent operation. And given that the invading force is attacking the same general area as where these ships are located, that's it does give them quick time to the action, but that is a huge threat. And this is every time you start a story like this and the odds seem insurmountable, I'm almost crippled with what are they going to do? How are they going to get past this? Knowing that there's going to be some interesting developments as we continue. So I think it's just best if we continue.
So let's talk about what the Japanese Southern Force actually looked like. Because understanding the weight of what was bearing down on Balikpapan is essential to appreciating what Talbot and his four destroyers were walking into. The operation to seize Balikpapan was part of a broader Japanese offensive framework that had been in planning long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. Japanese imperial strategy in the opening phase of the Pacific War was built around speed. Hit hard, move fast, consolidate before the Allies can recover, and present the world with a feint accompli so geographically fast and logistically complex that rolling it back becomes almost unthinkable. Balikpapan was one node in that framework. Not the only one, not even the most important one in isolation, but a critical piece of that oil equation that drove the entire Southern advance. The man with overall responsibility for Japanese naval operations in this theater was Vice Admiral Aibo Takahashi, commanding the Third Fleet. Under his umbrella, the specific operation against Balikpapan fell to a force built around the landing mission, getting troops ashore, securing the port, and preserving as much of the petroleum infrastructure as possible. The invasion convoy that assembled for this operation was substantial. 16 transports, 16 ships loaded with troops, equipment, vehicles, ammunition, everything an amphibious force needs to seize and hold a coastal objective. Those 16 transports were carrying elements of the 56th Regimental Group, seasoned Japanese Army infantry who had already been bloodied in earlier operations. These were not green troops. They were part of a military machine that had been fighting in China since 1937. They had just executed a stunning campaign down the Malay Peninsula, and that had every reason to believe this operation, like the ones before it, would go according to plan. The naval escort screening these transports was built around four destroyers: Natsuyo, Hatsushumo, Yamaka, and Yukikazi, along with a collection of smaller patrol craft and auxiliary vessels. It was a competent escort for a convoy of this type. Not overwhelming, but sufficient for what the Japanese expected to face. And what did they expect to face? Possibly Dutch submarines, possibly some air harassment, a determined surface attack by American destroyers in the middle of the night. That was not high on the probability list. Before the American destroyers ever entered the picture, the Allies had already been throwing what they had at this convoy. The effort was real, and it was costly, and it mostly didn't work, which tells you something important about the state of Allied capabilities in this theater at this moment in the war. Dutch submarines had been operating aggressively in the waters around Borneo. The KXII and the KXVIII both made attacks on Japanese shipping in the days leading up to the landing. The KXVIII claimed hits on at least one transport. Results were different. Results were difficult to confirm. Submarine warfare in 1942 for all sides involved a significant gap between claimed sinkings and confirmed ones. But the Dutch boats were in the fight, pressing their attacks under difficult conditions, and they deserve credit for that. What they were doing, what they could do, what they were doing what they could with what they had, in a pattern that would define Allied efforts in this theater for months to come. Allied air power also took swings at the convoy. American B 17 flying fortresses flying out of Java made high altitude bombings runs against Japanese shipping. And here we run into one of the most persistent myths of early Pacific War air power: the idea that high altitude heavy bombers were an effective anti shipping weapon. They were not. Hitting a moving ship from high altitude with unguided bombs in 1942 required a combination of skill, favorable conditions, and luck that rarely aligned. The B 17s flew their missions, they dropped their bombs. They came back with claims of hits and damages. The confirmed results were deeply underwhelming. The convoy kept moving. Dutch naval aircraft also participated. The limited air assets the KNIL, the Dutch colonial military, could bring to bear, they were outclassed and outnumbered, operating against Japanese air cover that had already demonstrated its lethality across the theater. They pressed their attacks anyway. None of it stop the convoy. By January 23rd, 1942, the Japanese transports were arriving off Balikpapan and began to put troops ashore. The Dutch garrison defending the town, never strong enough to hold against a force of this size, was already in the process of conducting demolitions and withdrawing. The oil facilities were being destroyed as thoroughly as time allowed. The fires that would light up the horizon for Talbot's destroyers were the result of these demolitions. The Dutch making sure that even in defeat, they denied the Japanese the fully intact prize they were after. It was an act of strategic spite, and it was the right call. The Japanese were moving ashore, securing the beachhead, beginning the process of consolidating control over the town and port. The convoy was anchored, the transports sitting in the roadstead, the escort vessels patrolling in a pattern designed for submarine threats rather than surface attack. The Japanese commanders on scene had every reason to feel confident. Their air attacks had failed. The submarine attacks had been manageable. The landing was proceeding on schedule. What they did not know, could not have anticipated with any reasonable operational assessment, was that 4 American destroyers were at that moment running south through the Macassar Strait in the dark, using the light of the burning refineries as their navigation beacon, with Commander Paul Talbot on the bridge of the John D. Ford, and a plan that depended entirely on the Japanese not seeing them coming. They didn't see them coming.
This is quite an interesting story. And one of the things I thought at the beginning of this episode is that the Japanese had somehow blown up the refinery. And then as you continued, you mentioned that they wanted to capture the refinery for the oil resource because that is how and that's how every army at this time is moving their military equipment, is with oil. It's crucial. It should have dawned on me that the Dutch sabotaged it themselves when they saw that, oh, yeah, we're hosed here. There's no stopping this. We need to do something. And that is the something that they did. And we've talked in previous episodes about scuttling ships so they're unavailable to the enemy.
Yep.
And this is just a larger version of that. That would be a bit of a disappointment, I would imagine, if you're a Japanese commander and everything is running smoothly, relatively speaking, and all of a sudden the very prize that you're after you see in flames. That would have to be very, just like a gut punch. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And then in that emotional state, you're realizing, I still need to follow orders. I still need to capture this. There's an attacking force coming for you, totally unexpected, and frankly, totally outclassed, or you outclassed completely. But that surprise in that moment, I could see making all the difference in the world, and I have a feeling it will. One thing that I've observed in each of the stories we've gone over with the U.S. naval history is that American adaptability and initiative has proven to often to be the difference maker. And I would like to see that happen again. I don't know how this is going to end, but I have a feeling that it will.
Before we get to the moment of contact, we need to spend some time with the American side of this equation. Because the ships and the men who crewed them are central to understanding why this engagement is worth remembering at all. 4 destroyers. That's what the United States Navy had available for this operation. Not a battleship, not a cruiser, not even a modern destroyer fresh from the yards. 4 aging, 4 stacked relics of a previous generation of naval warfare, operating at the ragged edge of their mechanical limits in waters far from any meaningful logistical support. Understanding these ships were and what they weren't is the only way to properly appreciate what Talbot asked of them. The 4 ships were USS John D. Ford, USS Pope, USS Parrott, and USS Paul Jones. All four were Clemson-class destroyers, a design that dated to the First World War era. They were laid down between 1919 and 1920, commissioned into a navy that was still processing the lessons of Jutland, and they were great surface engagements of the war that was supposed to end all wars. By 1942, they were old, not museum pieces. They were still fighting ships, still capable of speed and aggression, but old in the way that matters operationally, old in their engineering plants, old in their systems, old in the wear patterns on equipment that had been pushed hard for 2 decades with maintenance that never quite as thorough as it needed to be. The Clemson class destroyers earned their nickname, Tin Cans, honestly. They were lightly built, lightly armored, designed for speed and torpedo attack rather than sustained surface combat. At full power, they could make around 35 knots, which was genuinely impressive for ships of their vintage and remained a tactical asset even in 1942. Speed was their primary defense. Speed and darkness, and the hope that the enemy's fire control was worse than it needed to be. Their armament was four 4-inch guns and 12 torpedo tubes. The tubes arranged in four triple mounts. On paper, 12 torpedoes per ship sounds formidable. In practice, the torpedo situation facing American destroyers in early 1942 was one of the war's more painful institutional failures. The Mark 15 torpedo, the standard destroyer launched weapon, was plagued with problems that the Navy's own bureaucratic culture had actively resisted acknowledging for years. Depth keeping issues, erratic running, premature detonation, duds. The men who fired these weapons and watched them fail to perform had been filing reports and raising concerns, and those concerns had been absorbed into a system that was not yet ready to confront the uncomfortable truth that its primary anti ship weapon was fundamentally unreliable. Talbot knew this. His skippers knew this. They were going into a torpedo attack with torpedoes they could not fully trust. The crews themselves were a mix of regulars and men who had come into a wartime navy moving faster than any peacetime expansion had been prepared to handle. The Asiatic fleet from which these ships came had a particular character. It attracted officers and enlisted men who were comfortable operating far from the institutional center of gravity of the Navy, comfortable with improvisation, comfortable with a kind of independent judgment that operating in distant waters with unreliable communications tends to develop. These were not pampered fleet sailors, accustomed to the support networks of Pearl Harbor or the East Coast yards. They were lean, adaptable, and by January 1942, they were very tired. Since December 7th, the Asiatic fleet's destroyers have been in near constant motion. Evacuations, patrols, escort missions, the grinding operational tempo of a naval force trying to contest Japanese advances across an enormous theater with wholly inadequate resources. Sleep was a luxury. Hot food was intermediate. Maintenance happened when there was time for it, which was not often enough. The men standing watch on these four destroyers as they headed south towards Balikpapan had been running on adrenaline and institutional stubbornness for 7 weeks. Now, the man responsible for putting these ships and these men into action was Commander Paul Talbot, commanding Destroyer Squadron 59 from the bridge of the John D. Ford. Talbot was a career Navy officer, a surface warfare man through and through, and he possessed the quality that the situation in the Southwest Pacific in January 1942 demanded above almost all others. A willingness to act offensively when the defensive calculus offered nothing better. His orders from Admiral Glassford gave him discretion. He was directed to attack the Balikpapan convoy if conditions permitted. That conditional framing was important. It put the judgment call on Talbot. He could have looked at these four aging ships, his unreliable torpedoes, his exhausted crews, the lack of air cover, the absence of radar, and concluded that conditions did not permit. Nobody would have court martialed him for that call. The odds were genuinely bad. Talbot looked at the same set of facts and reached the opposite conclusion. The burning refineries that the Dutch had lit gave him a navigational beacon and a chaotic visual backdrop that might conceal his approach. The night gave him cover from Japanese air. The anchorage, full of stationary transports, gave him targets. And the aggressive spirit that the situation demanded, the understanding that sitting still and waiting for better odds was its own kind of losing, gave him the will to order the attack. Glassford, for his part, supported the decision. He understood what Talbot was proposing and what it might cost. He also understood that in a theater where the Allies were being outmatched at nearly every turn, a night surface attack on an anchored convoy was exactly the kind of asymmetric audacity that might, just might, procure results disproportionate to the force being committed. Four tin cans, tired crews, questionable torpedoes, one commander with the nerve to use them. That was the Allied hand, and Talbot was about to play it.
I gotta tell you, that's a pretty good move. As much as I thought that was foolishness or suicide, yeah, you couldn't have asked for a better scenario given what he had. It's night. They are completely distracted and they are totally stationary. And I think those three, and they don't expect these ships to be anchored so closely and to be able to react so suddenly. That's another advantage. I'm not sure where their makeshift port was, but I'm pretty sure the Japanese didn't know either. Otherwise, they probably would have attacked that. This is a really rare opportunity to have a truly surprise attack. And as you were describing the scene, not having radar or torpedoes that are unreliable, that seems in this age mind blowing. It's what do you mean? We're going to shoot it. It might work. It might not. I don't know. And that was common. I mean, we talked about that in the Civil War episodes and World War I. I understand that it's a evolving technology that for a long time just was not reliable. And that's what he's got. And that's what he's going to go forward with. And yeah, he's got the 4-inch guns. That's probably going to be the main weapon, I'm sure. But this is bravery on display. And I'm sure that the sailors of those ships were hungry for something akin to victory, given what happened at Pearl Harbor and the constant defeats, like they were run from their home in the Philippines, right? Their home base. And so they've been on the losing end for a while, and they need something to really stick it to the enemy, and this is the perfect opportunity to do so. I have a feeling that played a big part in the decision making.
So Talbot was about to play it. But before the cards hit the table, there was a plan to build. And the plan itself tells you everything you need to know about the kind of warfare the opening months of the Pacific War demanded. It was not an elegant plan. There was no time for elegant. There was no intelligence apparatus feeding Talbot real time information about Japanese ship positions in the anchorage. There was no coordinated multi axis attack synchronized with airstrikes or submarine support. There was no rehearsal, no wargaming of contingencies, no detailed briefing packet built on weeks of reconnaissance photography. What Talbot had was a chart, a burning horizon, 4 ships, and a window of darkness that would not last forever. The core concept was straightforward, which was both its strength and its limitation. The 4 destroyers would approach the Balikpapan anchorage from the north, running down the Makassar Strait at high speed under cover of darkness. The burning refineries ashore would serve a dual purpose. They would give Talbot's ships a navigational reference point and simultaneously backlight the Japanese vessels in the anchorage, silhouetting the transports against the flames and making them easier to identify as targets. The Americans, approaching from the darker northern quadrant of the strait, would be harder to see against the unlit water behind them. Once inside the anchorage, the destroyers would conduct torpedo attacks on the anchored transports. The priority targets, the troop ships, the logistical backbone of the invasion. After torpedoes were expanded, they would shift to gunfire, using their 4-inch deck guns to engage whatever targets presented themselves. Then they would accelerate back out of the anchorage, heading north up the strait, and put distance between themselves and whatever Japanese response had organized itself by that point. Simple, direct, dependent on speed, surprise, and the willingness to accept a significant degree of tactical chaos once the shooting started. Talbot organized his four Talbot organized his 4 ships into a column for the approach, with John D. Ford leading, followed by Pope, Parrott, and Paul Jones. The column formation made sense for the approach. It simplified navigation through unfamiliar waters at night and concentrated the force for the initial penetration of the anchorage. Once inside, the ships would have more freedom to maneuver, attacking targets of opportunity as they presented themselves. The timing was deliberate. Talbot wanted to arrive at the anchorage in the darkest hours of the night, late enough that the Japanese would be settling into the rhythms of a landing operation in progress. Their attention on the beach rather than the northern approaches, but early enough to complete the attack and begin withdrawal before the first gray light of dawn began to expose his ships to the threat he feared most: Japanese air power. That fear was not abstract. It was grounded in the operational reality of the theater. Daylight meant Japanese aircraft. Japanese aircraft meant the kind of threat they had already sent Prince of Wales and Repulse to the bottom of the South China Sea. Talbot's destroyers, caught in the open water at dawn by Japanese land-based bombers or carrier aircraft, would have almost no viable defense. He needed to be in, through, and running north before the sky began to lighten. This imposed a hard time constraint on the entire operation. Whatever the destroyers accomplished in that anchorage, they had to accomplish it quickly. There was no option to loiter, to make repeated careful passes, to wait for better firing solutions. The attack would be aggressive, fast, and necessarily imprecise. A raid rather than a deliberate engagement. Now, there was one additional complication that Talbot had to factor into his planning, and it speaks directly to the torpedo reliability problem we discussed earlier. Standard doctrine for a torpedo attack called for careful approach, precise range estimation, and deliberate firing at angles calculated to maximize the probability of hits. That doctrine assumed torpedoes that ran true, at the depth they were set for, and detonated when they were supposed to. Talbot knew, everyone in the Asiatic Fleet's destroyer force knew, that these assumptions were not safe ones. His solution was volume. If individual torpedoes couldn't be trusted to perform reliably, the answer was to fire enough of them that even a percentage hit rate produced meaningful results. This meant accomplishing less precise firing solutions in exchange for higher rates of fire. a conscious departure from doctrine driven by a realistic assessment of equipment limitations. It was the kind of adaptive judgment that good tactical commanders make when the tools available don't match the tools the manual assumes. Talbot briefed his skippers. The commanding officer of Pope, Parrott, and Paul Jones received their orders and understood the mission. There was not a great deal of discussion about recorded about reluctance or hesitation. These were destroyermen. Night surface attack was precisely the kind of mission their ships and their training were built for, even if the specific circumstances, aging ships, bad torpedoes, and no support, were far from ideal. There was, by all accounts, a grim readiness among the officers and crews that spoke less to enthusiasm for the odds and more to a professional acceptance that this was the job and the job needed doing. By the evening of January 23rd, 1942, the four destroyers were underway. The plan was set. The window of darkness was opening. Balikpapan was burning 60 miles to the south, and the light of those fires was already visible on the horizon, painting the bottom of the clouds in shades of orange and red. Talbot had his beacon. He had his ships. He had his plan. Now came the hardest part of any operation, the approach. The miles between the decision and the moment of contact, when everything that could go wrong hasn't gone wrong yet. And the only thing left to do is close the distance and commit. The 410 cans pointed south and increased speed.
Oh man, it's about to go down. That's all I can think of. I just wanted to give you an idea of what's going on in my head right now. Volume of torpedoes, that makes sense. Like you said at the top, what's the difference between a destroyer and a cruiser? The destroyers are the most maneuverable. And so the plan is hit as much as you can and then get out. And so when dealing with unreliable equipment, just throw it all at it and hopefully something will hit. That I've followed that approach many times in my life. Just try. And I was thinking, you said each ship had 12 torpedo tubes in sets of 4, I think. Now, on a destroyer, they're all in the same location. Like, it's not some are fore, some are aft, or starboard. They're all in
Oh,
the front of the ship, would you say?
no. Well, first of all, it's 3 torpedo tubes per stack, 4 stacks total to make the 12.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And no, they would be stationed 2 on the port side, 2 on the starboard side.
I see. So I was just trying to imagine when you say, I'm just going to throw a huge quantity at the enemy, how fast could that happen? And so if it's stacks of 3, I guess 3 at a time per ship, 12 potentially.
You could loose, if they were loaded and ready to go, 12 torpedoes once the order to fire is given.
I see.
You could loose 12 torpedoes at a time.
Now, that sounds devastating, but again, these torpedoes are not reliable. And so who knows how many of them will actually explode. That is an incredible plan. But it's perfect. Launch all the torpedoes you can, start shooting with the guns, and then probably as soon as you see any movement towards you, leave. They've already lost the 2 ships like you mentioned earlier, the Prince of Wales and the other one whose name I cannot remember. So they know what the stakes are. They know what happens if you engage an enemy unprepared, or if you're unprepared, or if they have a monumental advantage, and this is the best advantage they have, so go forward boldly. Yeah, I'm still tense over here, but let's just keep going.
The 4 tin cans pointed south and increased speed. And now begins the part of any naval engagement that doesn't make it into the dramatic retelling as often as it should: the approach. The miles of open water between the decision and the moment of contact. The time when the plan is still intact, the ships are still whole, and the men aboard them are alone with their thoughts and the sound of the sea. It deserves our attention because what happened during that approach, the conditions the destroyers moved through, the challenges Talbot's navigators faced, the atmosphere aboard those ships in the hours before contact shaped everything that followed. The Makassar Strait is a body of water running roughly north to south between the islands of Borneo to the west and Celebes, modern day Sulawesi, to the east. At its narrowest point, it compresses to less than 100 miles wide, which sounds like plenty of sea, like plenty of sea room, which sounds like plenty of sea room until you factor in the navigational hazards, the currents, and the operational reality of running 4 ships in column at high speed in total darkness with no electronic navigation aids worth depending on. This was dead reckoning navigation in its purest form. Chart, compass, speed log, and the judgment of experienced officers who had spent careers learning to read water. The destroyers were running without lights. That goes without saying, but it's worth dwelling on for a moment. No running lights, no deck lighting, minimal interior light leaking from portholes or hatches. The ships were as dark as they could be made, which meant that keeping station in column, maintaining proper distance and bearing from the ship ahead was a matter of eyesight and seamanship in conditions that made both difficult. The officer of the deck on Pope, Parrott, and Paul Jones was watching the dark shape of the ship ahead, reading her wake, adjusting speed and course by feel as much as by instrument. The speed of the advance was not flat out. Talbot wanted to time his arrival at the anchorage carefully, and he also wanted to arrive with crews that were alert rather than exhausted by hours of high speed steaming. There is a physical toll to running a destroyer at full power. The noise, the vibration, the constant motion as the hull works through swells. And men who had been riding that for hours are not as sharp as men who have been brought up to speed deliberately, conserving their edge for the moment it matters. The weather was cooperating, more or less. The night was dark, the kind of darkness that the equatorial Pacific produces when cloud cover obscures the stars. A darkness that feels thick and close rather than merely absent of light. There was some sea running, enough to put a gentle corkscrewing motion into the hulls of the destroyers, enough to break up the reflections on the water's surface. Not rough enough to impede the ships or exhaust the crews. The conditions were, by the standards of what Talbot needed, workable. And then there was the fire. As the destroyers pushed south, the glow on the horizon grew. What had been a dim orange suggestion of light when they departed became, mile by mile, something more dramatic. The Dutch demolitions at Balikpapan were doing their work. The oil storage facilities were burning with the particular ferocity that petroleum fires produce. Massive, sustained, almost geological in their scale. The column the columns of smoke rising from those fires were invisible against the dark sky, but the light they generated was extraordinary. The entire southern horizon was illuminated. The underside of the cloud deck glowed. The water ahead of the destroyers reflected the flames in broken, shifting patterns. For Talbot's navigators, this was a gift. The burning city on the horizon is, functionally, a lighthouse, a fixed reference point that tells you where you are relative to your destination, with a clarity that no dead reckoning calculation can fully match. The navigators on John D. Ford were able to confirm their position and approach heading against the bearing of the fires, correcting the small accumulated errors that hours of dead reckoning inevitably introduce. The Dutch, in destroying what they couldn't defend, had inadvertently lit the path for the men coming to avenge them. But the fire was a double edged navigational tool. Yes, it helped the Americans fix their position. It also created a visual environment of extraordinarily complexity inside the anchorage itself. Smoke drifting across the water, patches of flame reflected in the strait, the silhouettes of ships appearing and disappearing as smoke banks moved across the line of sight, burning debris on the water's surface in places. The kind of visual chaos that makes identification difficult, that creates false contacts and masks real ones, that turns a straightforward torpedo attack into something considerably more complicated. Aboard the destroyers, the crews were at battle stations. The gun crews were at their mounts. The torpedo men were at their tubes. The engineers were below, coaxing every reliable revolution out of the engines that had been running hard for weeks. The officers on the bridges were scanning the darkness ahead with binoculars, looking for the shapes that would resolve out of the smoke and the firelight into Japanese ships. The tension at this stage of an attack is specific and hard to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. The waiting is over. The decision is made. The approach is nearly complete. There is nothing left to do but close the final miles and begin. The mind runs through contingencies, through training, through the steps that will need to happen in the next few minutes, in the right sequence. And underneath all of that, quiet and insistent, is the awareness that the men on those Japanese ships, once they understand what is happening, will be trying very hard to kill you. The fires of Balikpapan filled the southern sky. The anchorage was close now. The shapes of ships were beginning to resolve in the darkness ahead. Talbot gave the order to prepare for attack.
This is the more you recount the strategy involved, the more I can see the decision making process and the decision that he came to. Dead reckoning at night, no radar, no instrumentation. That's certainly not for the weak willed, but having that huge beacon of the fire, which of course was not an intentional, like they didn't coordinate with the Dutch to get that going, but it happened, and all of a sudden they have a beacon that they can follow. And that's exactly where they need to be. And there's still so many things against them, but the fact that there's a huge fire on one end and they're in the shadow. So not only are the Japanese closer to the fire, but everything. If you've been camping and you've looked at a fire and then you look away from the fire, it's even darker than it would be if you just looked at the darkness and let your eyes adjust. And so that's what we're going to have the advantage in approaching from that direction. Ah, gosh, this is going to be something else. And yeah, you were right. Torpedoes, then guns. And that makes sense. I'm just hoping it goes well. And at this point, you're not looking for total victory. That you know that you're not going to demolish all the ships and stop the invasion. You're just looking to have a death by 1,000 cuts and be many of those cuts here and see if you can cripple the fleet somehow so that in a future engagement, they don't have their best and brightest at the helm, or they don't have their finest equipment, or, yeah, this is tight. Let's keep going.
Talbot gave the order to prepare for attack, and with that, the approach was over. What followed was something that no amount of training, no amount of peacetime exercises, no careful reading of tactical manuals fully prepares a man for. The moment when the plan meets reality, and the two things turn out to be only distantly related. The destroyers were entering the anchorage now. The fires ashore were close enough that the men on the open bridges could feel the heat. or believed they could, which in the psychology of combat amounts to the same thing. The smoke was thicker here, rolling across the water in banks that alternatively revealed and concealed the shapes ahead. And those shapes, dark, massive, sitting low and still in the water, were Japanese transports. Dozens of them, anchored, loaded, vulnerable in the way that only a ship sitting still in the water can be vulnerable. The first contact came almost simultaneously with the entry into the anchorage. Lookouts on John D. Ford began calling targets. The challenge immediately was not finding ships to shoot at. There were ships everywhere, but identifying them with enough certainty in the smoke and firelight to commit to a firing solution. This was not an environment that rewarded hesitation, and Talbot had no intention of hesitating. The column was inside the anchorage. The element of surprise, if it still existed, was measured in minutes at most. The time to fire was now. John D. Ford began her torpedo attack. The Mark 15s went into the water. The first American torpedoes fired in anger against Japanese surface ships in the Second World War. It is a moment worth marking, even in the chaos of what surrounded it. 7 weeks after Pearl Harbor, American sailors were shooting back. Not from the air, not from submarines, but from the deck of a destroyer in a burning anchorage in the middle of the night at close range, in conditions that were almost laughably far from the controlled scenarios of peacetime exercises. And then the torpedo problems started. Some of the fish ran true, others did not. The depth keeping issues that plagued the Mark 15 meant that torpedoes set for a specific running depth were not reliably staying at that depth. Some running too deep, passing beneath the hulls of the targets without detonating. Others ran erratically, curving off their intended tracks in ways that forced the plotting teams to revise their assessments of what was happening in real time. The premature detonation problem, torpedoes exploding before they reached their targets, added to the confusion, producing flashes and concussions that initially looked like hits, but weren't. Pope was next in column, following Ford into the anchorage and selecting her own targets from the shapes resolving out of the smoke. Her torpedo attack went in. Then Parrott, then Paul Jones, bringing up the rear of the column and finding the anchorage increasingly chaotic as she made her runs. Smoke thicker now, the water lit by explosions and fire. Japanese vessels beginning to move as the realization spread throughout the convoy that something was very wrong. Because here's the thing about the Japanese response in those first critical minutes: it was slow, agonizingly, almost inexplicably slow by the standards of what the American commanders had feared. The Japanese escort destroyers, the Natshio and her sisters, were not immediately in position to intervene. The convoy had been organized for an amphibious landing operation, with attention focused on the beach, on the troops going ashore, on the logistics of the landing itself. The threat axis that they were prepared for was submarines, underwater, slow moving, predictable in their tactical options. Four destroyers materializing out of the darkness at high speed from the north was a threat profile they were not postured to handle quickly. This confusion, this critical window of Japanese disorganization, was the margin that made the attack survivable for Talbot's ships. Every minute that the Japanese escort took to identify what was happening, to get their own ships moving, to organize a coherent response, was a minute that the American destroyers were inside the anchorage, firing torpedoes as stationary transports. It was not a long window, but it was long enough. The torpedo attacks produced results, even accounting for the reliability problems. Several Japanese transports were hit. The Sumanura Maru took torpedo hits and began to go down. The Tsuruga Maru was struck and heavily damaged. Other transports were hit with results that were harder to confirm in the chaos of the engagement. Damage that ranged from fatal to serious depending on where the torpedo struck and how the flooding progressed. The full accounting would take time and the patient work of post war records examination to establish with any confidence. But in the moment inside that anchorage, the Americans could see things burning that hadn't been burning before their torpedoes went in. They could see the unmistakable list of ships taking on water. They could see the frantic activity on the decks of transports as Japanese troops and crews responded to the disaster unfolding around them. The attack was working, not perfectly. The torpedo problem was real and costly in terms of potential damage not delivered, but working. And then, as the last of torpedoes went into the water, the nature of the engagement began to shift. The tubes were empty, or nearly so. The Japanese were waking up. The escort destroyers were moving. The window of relative impunity that the Americans had enjoyed in those first few savage minutes was closing. Talbot's ships needed to shift to guns, and the anchorage, already chaotic, was about to get considerably more violent.
Yeah, this is the inflection point. Once the Japanese realize something is amiss and they begin to respond, that's when the danger really begins. Because when you're attacking a target, even with torpedoes that are unreliable and launching shells, that you could do that all day if they're just going to stay there. But once they start moving in a direction to counterattack, that is the most dangerous. And you need to make a decision. Do you keep pushing? Do you flee? What makes the most strategic sense? I am not, and I will confess, I am not a commanding officer in the Navy, nor have I ever been. So I don't feel qualified to know when that threshold is met. But I have to imagine that the training and the experience that these guys have, it's all coming to bear now. And the discipline that the guys loading the torpedoes have, for example, they're just going to keep doing their job until ordered not to. They don't know what's happening out there. They just know what they're supposed to do. And when I think about these particular moments, it really does highlight the professionalism that we've seen throughout many episodes in the U.S. Navy History podcast. We see guys just going through precisely what they've been trained to do, what they've been drilled to do, and what they do with execution perfection. They're just going to keep doing it in spite of any obstacles that may be hampering them, such as defective ordnance. But there is a trust that comes with, yeah, my commander will know when it's time to move. And when it's time to move, the guys that are in charge of moving us will move us. And that kind of coordination and teamwork is so vital for, frankly, any Navy. But we see it highlighted so well in situations just like this when we talk about the different stories that we're pulling from. Now, again, they're not going to go for total victory here. And I think nobody imagines that's the case. But I'm sure they can do a significant amount of damage. And it's unfortunate. Like, even I was thinking about as you were discussing when they were launching the torpedoes, and some of them were going off course, and some of them were going too deep, and they were missing targets as a result. If they had a radio or some kind of shared communication systems, each ship, when they were trying to come up with the attack solution, they'd be able to coordinate and learn from the previous ship's calculations and then calculate differently.
They
But
did.
alas, that probably did
They
they?
do have radios. They are communicating.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's I guess at the top of the episode, I just was thinking about all the technology they didn't have. And I know radio existed at this point, but I didn't know if the various folks that were coordinating and calculating the attack could share that to the next ship, to the next ship, to the next ship. I guess, yeah, why not? Why wouldn't they if the technology's there?
Yeah, each boat has a radio. That's the whole point of having radiomen.
I'm gonna have to sit back and think about my faux pas and how I made a huge mistake in front of our entire audience. That's okay. That's why I'm here, so I can make the mistakes that on behalf of the audience. And so now we've all learned something, I hope. Okay, that's good. Yeah, this is a tense situation. And this is where the Japanese response comes to bear, and we'll see what happens next.
The transition from torpedo attack to gun action is not a simple mechanical switch. It represents a fundamental change in the tactical geometry of the engagement. Torpedoes are a standoff weapon. You fire them from a distance, and if the geometry is right, the weapon does the work. Guns require you to close the range, to stay in the fight at closer quarters, to accept the enemy's guns are now just as relevant as your own. For four aging destroyers in a crowded anchorage with Japanese escort ships finally beginning to organize a response, shifting to gun action meant accepting a significantly higher level of risk in exchange for the opportunity to do more damage before withdrawing. Talbot accepted that risk. The 4-inch guns of John D. Ford, Pope, Parrott, and Paul Jones opened up on whatever targets presented themselves: transports, patrol craft, smaller auxiliary vessels moving through the anchorage in various states of panic and confusion. The gun crews, who had been standing at their mounts throughout the entire torpedo phase, now had work to do, and they did it. The scene inside the anchorage at this point defies any simple linear description. It was not a clean, ordered engagement where ships A fired at ship B and ship C maneuvered to support. It was chaos, productive, directed chaos on the American side, genuine, disorganized chaos on the Japanese side, played out against a backdrop of burning oil, drifting smoke, exploding ammunition on damaged transports, and the constant motion of ships moving at high speed through water crowded with anchored vessels, debris, and the small craft that Japanese landing operations use to put troops ashore. The American destroyers were weaving high speed turns to bring torpedo tubes to bear, had given way to high speed turns to bring gun mounts to bear, to avoid collisions with
Oh.
anchored Japanese vessels looming out of the smoke, to present a harder target to Japanese gunners who are now beginning to find their range. The navigational challenge of threading through a crowded anchorage at speed in darkness was considerable under any circumstance. Under fire, with smoke reducing visibility to hundreds of yards in places, it was an extraordinary feat of seamanship. There were near misses, not just from Japanese fire, but from each other and from the Japanese ships themselves. At one point during the gun action phase, American destroyers came close enough to anchor Japanese transports that the engagement was almost point blank. Guns depressed to near flat trajectories. The muzzle blast of the 4-inch guns illuminating the sides of Japanese vessels just hundreds of yards away. At these ranges, even a 4-inch shell does meaningful damage to an unarmored transport hull. The Japanese escort destroyers were now in the fight. Natsushio, Natsushio and her companions had gotten underway and were attempting to intercept the American ships, firing as they maneuvered. Japanese gunfire was landing in the water around the American destroyers, close enough to drench bridge personnel with spray, close enough to make the men at exposed gun mounts acutely aware of their vulnerability. The Americans were taking the engagement to the Japanese in their own anchorage, and the Japanese were fighting back with increasing organization and effectiveness as the minutes passed. And this is where something remarkable happened. Or rather, where something remarkable failed to happen. None of the four American destroyers were strunk. None were even seriously damaged in a way that threatened their ability to fight or withdraw. In an anchorage full of Japanese warships, with escort destroyers actively engaging, with the tactical situation deteriorating by the minute, Talbot's 4 tin cans absorbed the chaos and kept moving. Part of this was speed. The destroyers never stood still long enough to be an easy target. Part of it was the visual environment. The same smoke and fire that complicated the American attack complicated Japanese fire control even more because the Japanese gunners were trying to track fast moving targets against a dark background while their own burning ships threw irregular light across the water. Part of it was the organizational disruption the torpedo attack had caused. Japanese commanders, who should have been coordinating the escort response, were dealing with the simultaneous crisis of multiple transports taking damage and flooding. And part of it, frankly, was fortune. Combat at this intensity, at this range, in these conditions, involves a significant element of chance. The shells that landed close instead of on target, the torpedoes fired by Japanese escorts that didn't find their marks. These outcomes were not entirely the product of skill, they were also the product of luck. Talbot and his men had skill in abundance. On this night, they also had luck, and they were not too proud to need it. The withdrawal decision came with Talbot assessed that the torpedo tubes were empty. The gun action had run its productive course, and the Japanese response was organized enough that continued presence in the anchorage was adding risk without adding proportionate damage. The order went out: form up, head north, maximum speed. The 4 destroyers came out of the anchorage and drove hard up the Makassar Strait, putting miles between themselves and the Balikpapan, as fast as their aging engines could manage. Behind them, the anchorage burned with a new intensity. Not just the Dutch demolition fires now, but Japanese transports adding their own pyres to the night sky. The escort destroyers gave chase briefly, but did not press it. By the time the sun began to lighten the eastern horizon, the dawn that Talbot had been racing against from the moment the attack began, his 4 ships were clear of the immediate threat area and driving hard for the safety of distance. All 4 destroyers made it out. Every man who had gone in came out. The anchorage they left behind told a different story.
That is unreal. If you would have asked me at the beginning of when you described what was going to happen as far as 4 World War I destroyers going up against an invading force of a more modern fleet, I would have said we're probably going to lose 3, maybe? I have to imagine there would have to be some survivors for this story to make its way to here, but not to have a scratch. That is literally incredible. That is beyond what I'm able to comprehend based on what the odds were, based on the where the advantages were technologically. But that just goes to show you what proper planning and execution can do, and understanding the terrain and environment and situation and what advantages you can expose if need be. And like you said earlier, if this was daylight, it would have been a different story because Japanese air cover would have changed the dynamic completely. But at night, that was when they could be offensive. And they were. And I can understand now why they started with torpedoes, because I was wondering, guns, torpedoes, which do you do first? But as soon as you said muzzle flash, I'm like, oh yeah, you don't want to highlight where you're located too soon. But the torpedoes would have allowed the the surprise to last just a little bit longer. And then by then, you said that many of the transport ships were taking on water and smoking and were on fire, and thus complicating the vision of the Japanese gunners even more. This is outstanding. The- I'm surprised this story isn't shared more as like the ultimate underdog story in a way. It's not a scratch. That's amazing.
The anchorage they left behind told a different story. But what exactly was that story? Because this is the point in the episode where we have to put down the narrative and pick up the ledger. And the ledger, as it's so often the case, is the honest accounting of military history, is more complicated than the headline suggested at the time. Let's start with the claims, because the claims matter. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the reports flowing back through the Allied command chain were optimistic, significantly optimistic. The fog of war that had filled the anchorage with smoke and fire, and the chaos of a night surface engagement, had also filled the initial damage assessments with a generosity that the post war record would not fully support. Claims of ships sunk ran as high as a dozen or more transports destroyed. The numbers that circulated in press reports and official communique in the days following January 24th painted a picture of a devastating American strike that had badly mauled the Japanese invasion force. The reality, established through careful post war examination of Japanese records, was more modest. 4 Japanese transports were confirmed sunk. A patrol boat, the P 37, was also sunk. Additional transports suffered damage of varying severity. In terms of Japanese personnel, the losses were real. Troops and crew members went down with those ships, and the material losses represented genuine logistical damage to the invasion force. But here is what the 4 sunken transports did not accomplish. They did not stop the invasion of Balikpapan. The Japanese landed. The troops got ashore. The town fell. The oil facilities, already partially demolished by the Dutch, came under Japanese control on the operational timeline of the Japanese South advance. The first Battle of Balikpapan was a speed bump. A costly one, measured in ships and men, but a speed bump nonetheless. The strategic objective the Japanese had come for was achieved on schedule. This is the honest assessment, and it matters. Military history that papers over operational failure with tactical heroism does a disservice to the historical record and to the men whose service deserves honest evaluation. Talbot's raid did not change the outcome at Balikpapan. That needs to be said clearly. And then, having said it clearly, we need to say something else equally clearly. The question of what a military action accomplished cannot be answered solely by asking whether it changed the immediate operational outcome. There are other ledgers, other measures of what a battle does and means. Consider the material exchange. 4 aging American destroyers, ships that by any objective assessment were the bottom of the Allied naval barrel in early 1942, entered a defended anchorage and came out with 4 enemy transports sunk, additional vessels damaged, Japanese troops and equipment destroyed, and all 4 of their own ships intact. In a theater where the Allies were absorbing catastrophic losses with almost nothing to show for them, where capital ships were going to the bottom, where air forces were being destroyed on the ground, where garrison after garrison was falling to Japanese assault, Talbot's destroyers had hit the enemy hard and gotten home. That is not nothing. In January 1942, that was almost everything. Consider the morale dimension. The United States was 7 weeks out from Pearl Harbor. The American public had absorbed a series of shocks that had no real precedent in the nation's modern experience. The destruction of the battleship fleet, the fall of Wake Island, the siege of the Philippines, the relentless Japanese advance across a theater so vast it barely fit on a single map. Into that environment, the news of 4 American destroyers attacking a Japanese invasion convoy and sinking ships produced a response that was disproportionate to the tactical scale of the action. It told a story that Americans desperately needed to hear, that their sailors were fighting back, that the Navy was in the war, that the enemy could be hurt. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, took note. Glassford's forces received recognition. Talbot and his skippers were commended. The action was held up as an example of the aggressive spirit that the Navy needed to cultivate across the fleet. In an institution that was simultaneously absorbing hard lessons about its own doctrinal and material failures, the torpedo problems being the most painful of these, the first battle of Balikpapan offered something to build on. And then there were the tactical lessons. The night surface engagement at Balikpapan was, in many respects, a preview of the kind of fighting that would define the naval war in the Solomon Islands in 1942 and 1943. The slot, the body of water running through the central Solomons, would become the arena for a series of night surface engagements between American and Japanese destroyers and cruisers that would test both sides severely and ultimately produce the American tactical doctrine that won those battles. The men who fought at Balikpapan, the lessons absorbed about that night, torpedo employment, coordinated destroyer action, and the management of tactical chaos, these fed into a institutional learning process that the Navy desperately needed. The torpedo failures at Balikpapan also contributed, in a small but real way, to the accumulating pressure on the Navy's torpedo program. The reports from Talbot's destroyers added to a body of evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with American torpedoes. Evidence that the relevant bureaus continued to resist for another year before the problems were finally acknowledged and corrected. The cost of that institutional stubbornness, measured across the entire Pacific War, was enormous. But the documentation started somewhere, and the destroyer men who filed their frustrated after action reports in the weeks following Balikpapan were part of that process. 4 transports sunk, 4 destroyers home, 1 invasion not stopped. The ledger is complicated. The men who carried it deserve a complicated, honest accounting. Not dismissal, not something closer to the truth.
You know, I was listening to that list of positive effects from this conflict, this exchange, and the one thing I kept thinking about is, yeah, it's so great that the American Navy is able to adapt and take in this information and use it as a lesson for, oh, this is a great example of how to do this, or what to do when you're overmatched, or how to use concealment to your advantage. All these things are such great institutional learning devices. And then you move to, oh, yeah, they also mentioned how cruddy the torpedoes were and how they really needed to fix that. And they're like, I don't know about that. And I was like, no, you were so good. You were adapting, you were trying to improve. And yet, imagine the overall conflict with Japan in the Pacific and how many torpedoes were launched from American vessels and how many of them did not hit their target because of this stubbornness that has an actual cost. And like you said, there is a body of evidence that was being collected, and I'm sure it just grew and grew until the evidence was just undeniable. I'm sure whichever engineers or procurement officers or what have you would say, well, a couple of them failed. And so we have acceptable margins of failure. Not all of them can be perfect. But as you see a broader scope, a bigger picture of what's happening, and a majority of these are just not doing what they're supposed to, I'm glad they eventually did something. It would have been better if it was as quickly adopted as the tactics that were learned from this engagement. Again, adaptability and learning lessons is the key to success. And the U.S. Navy has proven that time and time again. I am trying to implement that in my own life. Hopefully, listener, you are as well. Yeah, this was a great example of what a team can do when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds, but when you look for a way to succeed and have a plan and execute, it's just awe inspiring.
Something closer to the truth. That's what we try to do on this podcast. Every episode. Not the clean version, not the version where every action is either a triumph or a disaster, where the heroes are flawless and the failures are someone else's fault. The version that holds the complexity without flinching from it. Because the men who were there lived the complexity, and they deserve to have it rendered honestly. So let's zoom out one final time. Let's talk about what the first battle of Balikpapan actually means, not just as a tactical engagement in January 1942, but as a moment in the longer arc of American naval history. It is first and foremost a first. The first engagement, the first surface engagement fought by United States Navy warships against the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Second World War. That designation carries weight independent of the tactical outcome. Every institution, every military force, every navy has its firsts. The moment when doctrine meets reality for the first time, when training becomes combat, when the men who have prepared for war discover what war actually asks of them. The first battle of Balikpapan was that moment for the surface warfare community of the United States Navy in the Pacific. Everything that came after, every night surface engagement in the Solomons, every destroyer action in the slot, every hard learned lesson about torpedo doctrine and night fighting and the management of chaos has a line running back to the Makassar Strait on the night of January 23rd, going into January 24th, 1942. That lineage matters. History doesn't move in clean chapters with clear beginnings and ends. It moves in accumulations of experience, of institutional memory of lessons absorbed and applied, and sometimes forgotten and relearned at terrible cost. The destroyermen who fought at Balikpapan were the opening entry in an accumulation that would eventually produce the tactical competence that won the night battles of the later Solomon's campaign. They paid tuition on lessons the Navy needed to learn. The fact that their names are not household words, that Talbot and his skippers don't occupy the same space in popular memory as Halsey or Spruance, doesn't diminish that contribution. It just means we have to work a little harder to find it. And that brings us to the men themselves. Because at the end of every episode, after the strategy and the tactics and the historical analysis, we come back to the people. The sailors who stood at gun mounts in the dark, the torpedo men who loaded and fired weapons they had every reason to distrust, the engineers below deck who couldn't see what was happening above them and kept the engines turning anyway, the officers on the bridges who made decisions in seconds that we would have been analyzing for 80 years. These were not extraordinary men in the sense of being unlike the rest of us. They were ordinary men in an extraordinary situation, doing what their training and their service and their sense of obligation told them to do. Many of them were young. Many of them had been in the Navy long enough to have expected a career of peacetime routine, of port visits and drills and slow accumulation of seniority, and instead found themselves in the Makassar Strait in January 1942, 7 weeks into a war that nobody had fully prepared for, and doing something that had never been done before. They did it anyway. All 4 ships came home. Every man who went into that anchorage came out of it. In the context of what the Pacific War would cost the United States Navy over the next 3.5 years, the thousands of ships damaged and sunk, the tens of thousands of sailors killed, the fact that Balikpapan produced no American losses feels almost miraculous. It wasn't miraculous. It was a product of good leadership, aggressive execution, sound seamanship, and yes, a measure of fortune that the men involved would have been the first to acknowledge. Commander Paul Talbot deserves to be remembered by name. He looked at a bad situation and chose offense. He built a plan from almost nothing, briefed it to his skippers, led from the front, and brought his squadron home. In a navy that was simultaneously producing examples of timidity and examples of reckless aggressive in the opening months of the war, Talbot threaded a needle. Bold enough to attack, disciplined enough to withdraw before the odds fully caught up with him. That is a harder balance to strike than it sounds. The first battle of Balikpapan will never be Midway. It will never carry the weight of Leyte Gulf or the drama of the surface engagements around Guadalcanal. It is a footnote in most histories, a paragraph, a sentence, sometimes nothing at all. We think that's a shame, not because the battle changed the course of the war, it didn't, but because the story of how a navy learns to fight, how it discovers what it's capable of, how it builds the institutional knowledge that eventually wins. That story has to start somewhere. It started here in the dark, in the smoke, with 4 old destroyers and the men who sailed them towards a burning horizon because the job needed doing and there was nobody else to do it. That's the story of the first Battle of Balikpapan, and that's why it belongs in the record. Not just the official record, but the living record that podcasts like this one tries to maintain. The record that says these men were here, they fought, and they deserve to be remembered.
That is one of my favorite things about this podcast. Stories you probably haven't heard of are highlighted and the relevance is showcased, not just how it impacted the broader thinking of a navy or the efforts of a nation to defeat an enemy, but also what these people had to go through when facing odds that were not ideal and at times overwhelmingly negative. Yet they persisted and they pushed through, and we are better for it as a nation. And I love hearing these examples because they are inspiring. They help showcase what preparation and drilling and courage and leadership can do. Like I said earlier, without the trust of that crew for each other, this would have been impossible. But knowing that everybody had drilled and was excellent at what they were supposed to do, in spite of running a ship that was a generation or two old, they were successful. And that was a coordinated team effort. And I'm still amazed that there was not one American casualty. That's incredible. I love hearing stories like that. Again, like you said, the invasion wasn't stopped. The Japanese kept rolling for a little while longer after this. And that's not, it is important, but it's also important to identify moments like this where people showed up to do what they could to either stop or slow down what was an overwhelming wave of domination, and they just try to do their part to stand in the way. And this is really incredible.
We want to honor one of our fallen angels with the help of HeroCards.us at the end of our episode, like we like to do at the end of every one of our episodes. And today we want to honor Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class Manuel Reyes Denton. His hometown was Kerrville, Texas, served with the U.S. Navy, Fleet Marine Force Pacific, 1st Marine Air Wing, Marine Air Base Squadron 16, HMM 361. He received the Air Medal, Purple Heart, and Navy Commendation Medal. His date of sacrifice was October 8th, 1963, killed in action in Quang Nam Province, South Vietnam. He was 22. Manuel Reyes Denton was born in San Antonio, Texas on June 18th, 1941. When he was a young man, Denton's mother became ill and was hospitalized. Denton was sent to live with his grandmother in Seguin, Texas, a 40-minute drive east of San Antonio, where he attended Joe F. Segert Junior High School and spent his free time helping the local sheriff train trick-performing horses. After his mother recovered, Denton rejoined her in their Kerrville, Texas home. He attended Tivy High School, where he met his future wife, Esmeralda. Manuel Denton enlisted in the U.S. Navy and graduated from Field Medical Service School in December of 1962, where he was trained in emergency medical treatment under combat conditions. As a hospital corpsman in the Navy, Denton also received some basic infantry training similar to that of the Marines. Assigned to Fleet Marine Force Pacific, 1st Marine Air Wing, Marine Air Base Squadron 16, HMM 361, Denton held the rank of Petty Officer 3rd Class. HMM 361 was a U.S. Marine heavy helicopter squadron known as the Flying Tigers, based at the Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, San Diego, California. In Vietnam, the squadron flew dangerous missions, often in combat conditions, in a 30D Choctaw helicopter. On October 8, 1963, Denton's helicopter, with a crew of 6, was sent to an area 43 miles west of the city Da Nang in Quang Nam Province, Vietnam. They were part of a search and rescue mission for 2 downed pilots. Under intense enemy ground fire, Denton's helicopter was hit and went down. There were no survivors. 4 of the 6 crew members' remains were recovered and identified, but the remains of Denton and his fellow crew member, Lance Corporal Luther E. Ritchie Jr., could not be found, despite a thorough search within a 250-yard radius. Denton and Ritchie were listed among the unaccounted for servicemen from the Vietnam War. Between 1991 and 2000, several teams led by the Joint POW MIA Accounting Command, or JPAC, traveled to Quang Nam Province to investigate the incident and interview witnesses. Joint teams from the U.S. and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam surveyed the crash site and found wreckage consistent with a 34D helicopter. More than 44 years later, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency was able to identify Denton's remains, and he was listed by the U.S. Department of Defense as accounted for on May 14, 2008. Crewman Lance Corporal Ritchie's remains had been identified in 2003. HM3 Manuel Reyes Denton left behind a wife and 3 young daughters. He's honored at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. His name inscribed on panel 01E, line 29. He is buried alongside his fellow crew members at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, grave 8656. Manuel Reyes Denton gave his life, coming to the rescue of others. So, Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class, Manuel Reyes Denton, we thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Christoph, get us out of here.
All right. Yes, sir. Thank you, first and foremost, to the listeners. I hope you learned something. I know I do every time. It's nice. Thank you for coming back, or thank you for joining us for the first time. We're just glad you're here. If you ever want to get a hold of us for whatever reason, maybe you heard something that a family member of yours was involved with, we'd love to hear from you. You can do that a couple of different ways. First, you can email us. The email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach us via Discord. If you look in the show notes, there is a link to our Discord server. You can join it and talk to us and other listeners as well. We're also on X Twitter, so if you want to tweet or message at us, whatever the parlance is nowadays, you may do so. Our handle is at USNHistoryPod. Finally, we see the numbers every week, and we see the trends and who's listening from what nation, and it's always encouraging. And we know that you're telling friends, family members, coworkers, please continue to do so. That helps us, and I don't know, why not share something you enjoy with someone you enjoy? It just multiplies the joy. Anyway, thank you for doing so. Please continue to help us, and we'll come back with more new and interesting stories for you.
And with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.
Bye.